great time afterwards to be able to do that. Last week, I thought this worked out a lot better than I even expected because, first off, because so many folks were willing to weigh in, and then second, selfishly for me, to get to always go deeper and deeper into our church history. And last week, we covered in 1 hour, in 1.5 hour, 10 years in the life of the church. This week, we're going to do a little better. We're going to cover 100 years in the life of the church. We're going to be looking at the period between the Elizabethan prayer book of 1559 and then the prayer book that was adopted under Charles II in 1662. And what I want to admit to on my research, this is mostly just a Google rabbit hole, just finding one citation, following where that goes to another citation, and it gave a great tour of English history in the 17th century. So if you took the 1559 prayer book and set it up against the 1662 prayer book side by side, you might say, what's the big fuss? I mean, they're nearly identical, and really all of them based on the first prayer book of Cranmer in 1549. And so you might think not that much happened in the life of the Church of England between Elizabeth and Charles II. But any of you that are history students know that's certainly not the case at all. I wanted to note first off that Elizabeth's prayer book of 1559 barely squeaked by Parliament. It had great majority in the House of Commons, but bishops all sat in the House of Lords at this time, along with the actual Lords. And in the House of Lords, it only won by 3 votes, and none of the bishops voted for it. And so it happened to be convenient that a small number of bishops were actually imprisoned in the Tower of London during the time of the vote, or it's likely it wouldn't have passed at all. But once it was passed, it really became the hallmark of this new way of being Christian in the world, that middle way, that via media that is part of the Elizabethan settlement. Now, up until the time of that prayer book, the debates and discussions of religion in England were between Protestants and Catholics. But when this middle way was created that became Anglicanism, that meant there were now 3 parties. There were the Catholics, the newly formed Church of England, the Anglicans, and then the radical Protestants that we know as the Puritans. So there were 3 parties now debating over the nature of the Eucharist, the nature of sacraments, the nature of salvation. And Elizabeth really accomplished an amazing task in her settlement that allowed all 3 of those branches to participate in the life of the Church of England, obviously with great tension, but it was her will to have an expansive view that might let all 3 parties have a place to belong. And that was also true under her successor, King James I of England and King James VI of Scotland. They were seeking that middle ground. Now, King James of Scotland, James VI, had become king when he was 1 year old because his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, had been forced to abdicate because of the Protestants in Scotland, along with some other reasons. But she abdicated her throne and he was coronated as a 1-year-old child. She then was on the run in battles and finally ended up imprisoned in England. Now she and her cousin Elizabeth were really contemporaries. They were only about 8 or 9 years apart in their ages. And if you want to see a beautiful and dynamic presentation of this, there was a great movie that came out in 2018 called Mary, Queen of Scots. It starred Margot Robbie as Queen Elizabeth and Saoirse Ronan as Mary, Queen of Scots. And so you can cue that up on Amazon Prime or on HBO. But I don't think it's much of a spoiler to say that it didn't end that well for Mary. And so upon her execution in 1587, Elizabeth's people in England began to lay the framework and the pathway for James to become her successor as the King of England. She was the Virgin Queen and therefore had no issue of her own. James was obviously the choice. And so there was dialogue between Elizabeth's people and the handlers of James VI of Scotland to plan for his taking over the throne. So when she died in 1603, in many ways, it was one of the smoothest transitions that we had as James became the King of England. But during these years, from 1560 until 1600, the Protestant movement in Scotland had really taken hold. We just heard from Tom about John Knox and his importance as a leader there, and really his importance in bringing down Mary, Queen of Scots. And so that church had moved away from the Episcopal structure, where the bishops are in charge, and had moved towards what is called a Presbyterian structure, where there's a body, the presbytery, made up of ministers and lay people who direct the church. An Episcopal-led church is an Episcopal church. A Presbyterian church is one that's led by ministers, which is what the word presbyter means in Greek. So the tension was already built in between the Protestants, the Anglicans, and the Catholics. And this would finally result in the English Civil War in the middle of the 17th century. So James came to the throne of England as a pretty experienced, astute ruler. The period of his rule was known as the Jacobean period, but it almost came to an end before it began. On November 5th, 1605, a group of disgruntled Catholics led by Guy Fawkes conspired to blow up the Houses of Parliament while the king was there calling the Parliament to session. Fawkes was literally caught with the torch lit that he was going to use to light a fuse that would have destroyed the Houses of Parliament. If you've been in England, Guy Fawkes Day is still a holiday where everyone sets bonfires to commemorate this date in history. But King James went on to really thread the needle between his Puritan and Catholic patrons. In terms of standing up against the Catholics, in 1606, Parliament passed something called the Pope Is Recusants Act, which required, again, any citizen to take an oath of allegiance denying the Pope's authority over the king. But James would allow any Catholic who would take that oath to practice their faith privately. So they weren't forced to convert to Anglicanism. They were simply forced to pledge their allegiance to the king. And this was because he knew in the battle he was going to have in Scotland against the Puritans that he could very well need the Catholics to be part of his cadre. And he was told the Earl of Northumberland, who at the time was a prominent Catholic, he was quoted as saying, he would not persecute any that will be quiet and give but an outward obedience to the law. So that's on the Catholic side. Then on the Puritan side, well, when this Scottish king, who had been handled by Protestants for so many years in Scotland, came to the throne, the Puritan clergy and lay people in England really thought they were going to rule the roost at this time. And they brought to the king something called the Millennia Petition. And it had their list of demands for the new king. Among them were to quit using the term priest, to abolish wedding rings, to abolish confirmation as a right of the bishop, and to return once again to cassock and surplice and to get rid of all the vestments. King James turned them down on all of those fronts. And so again, here he was finding that middle way, threading that needle between the Puritans and the Catholics. But he did do one thing at the beginning of his reign. He agreed with the Puritans' request that there be a new version of the Bible. And so King James, right after he took the throne, commissioned a group of 96 scholars to write what became known as the King James Bible. There's a wonderful book called God's Secretaries that goes into detail about the creation of that Bible. So that in 1611, the authorized version, the King James Version of the Bible, was finally adopted and then was printed and placed in every single English and Scottish church. He then, in those early years, reestablished the episcopacy in Scotland. It had really fallen into discord. The Kirk, the church, had not filled certain offices, but he quietly put together an episcopal structure in Scotland. But at the same time he was doing that, he allowed a lot of leeway for people to worship as they saw fit in Scotland. But he really believed in the episcopal form of worship. In fact, his other famous quote is, "No bishop, no king." So we've got Elizabeth, 1559, with that prayer book, King James with the King James Bible in 1611, his long reign coming to an end in 1625 meant that for about 2 generations, the Church of England was the established church for the entire Kingdom of England. Then in 1625, King James died, and his son, King Charles I, became king. These were not going to be good times for the monarchy. Immediately after his coronation as the King of England in 1625, he married a 15-year-old French Catholic princess, brought her to England as the Queen. She refused to convert. So for the first time since Mary I, there now was a Catholic queen in England. And this caused a lot of consternation among both the Anglicans and the Puritans. Well, in Scotland, even during the years of King James, when he was reestablishing sort of the Anglican form in Scotland, there had been much leeway for the church. And the church met in what was called the General Convention, and they many times would denounce what King James had offered as the rules for their churchmanship. King Charles decided he was now going to make an example of those Scottish Presbyterians. They resisted his being, excuse me, let me get a glass of water here. They really fought against his becoming the King of Scotland, and it was 8 years later before he could be coronated as Scotland's king. At his coronation, he had the highest Anglican church service of coronation you could ever imagine, as a way of thumbing his nose at all of these Scots Presbyterians. And there was rancor and rioting after his coronation. He then made a man named William Laud his Archbishop of Canterbury. William Laud was a high Anglican, nearly Catholic in his churchmanship. And together, King Charles and Archbishop Laud created a prayer book, a Book of Common Prayer for the Scottish people, without consulting with a single Scotsman. They then took the army into Scotland and enforced the imposition of the Scottish Book of Common Prayer of the 1630s on the local clergy and church, the Kirk. And rioting ensued. There's stories of the stoning of priests who tried to use the new prayer book. There's story of English troops having to be stationed at the door with muskets in order to protect those priests. And really, the Scottish church rejected that prayer book outright. They not only rejected the prayer book, but this became their impetus when the people began to see that the high church Anglicans were trying to impose their faith on the entire of Scotland, that the Scottish gentry rose up against King Charles in what was called the Bishops' Wars of the early 1540s. And this began the decline of Charles' reign that finally resulted in his execution in 1549. It was out and out war between England and Scotland over these issues and many other issues. The English Parliament was no friend of Charles either. He had dispersed them several times. He would not fight battles on the European continent on behalf of the Lutheran princes, which is what his parliament wanted him to be. But because of his Catholic sensibilities, he tried to remain neutral in those battles, and Parliament simply wouldn't have it. And so Parliament rose up and put together the new modern army, and they went against Charles. And so this is what we call the English Civil War. Well, Charles was actually, and his loyalists were doing fairly well in these battles. And so Oliver Cromwell, who was the protector and really became the head of the government in England, approached the Scottish Church and Parliament and asked them to invade from the north. They agreed on the condition that if they overthrew the king, there would be Presbyterian churchmanship in the Kingdom of England, and the Book of Common Prayer would be suspended. And so Cromwell agreed to that. They won the war. Archbishop Laud was imprisoned, and he was executed in 1645. King Charles was captured, tried, and he was executed. A king of England executed in 1649. So that's the period of time that we had in the English Civil War that led to a radically Puritan body of faith as the established church for all of England. They met in Parliament. They suspended the Book of Common Prayer. They appointed what was called the Westminster Assembly, which was the religious body that would determine all things religious for England. They adopted a new confession that actually became the underpinnings of the Congregational and Baptist churches later on. And they threw out the Book of Common Prayer and replaced it with a book called the Directory for Public Worship. This wasn't so much a full prayer book with liturgies for everything. In fact, there was no burial office in it. There was no wedding office in it. It was more a set of guidelines, because one of the principles of Presbyterian worship was that the priest or the minister should offer extemporaneous prayer rather than having to pray according to rote, as was determined in a officially licensed Book of Common Prayer. So this is what went on during the 1650s. There was, again, a lot of persecution. Many bishops fled the country. Many priests went into hiding. Many new ministers were assigned churches that had not been ordained by bishops. But Cromwell's son, after Cromwell died, couldn't hold this revolution together. And by this time, there was a widespread nostalgia for the Elizabethan period and for the time of King James. It's only 2 generations ago, and yet people thought that was what England should be. And Parliament finally acceded to that hope on behalf of the English people, and they invited Charles II, the son of Charles I, who had been in exile in Europe. They invited him home to take over the throne, and Charles II was seated in 1660 as the new King of England. I think Charles II must have been a fascinating character. He's more like his grandfather than his father. Seems to have been very astute in church politics. He also knew what the people had been longing for and were nostalgic about was court life, was the games and the pageantry and the jousts and all that, all those trappings that we have in all those movies about Henry VIII were what Charles II reinstituted in court life, court poetry, music, because all of that had been suppressed during the Puritan period under Cromwell. In fact, his nickname was the Merry Monarch. And so Charles II came to the throne, but what he also knew in coming to the throne, that one of his primary first acts was going to be to have to re-establish the Church of England as the official church in the kingdom. So what he did was he convened a group of scholars. They took up the prayer books that had been suppressed. They went through them, didn't make very many changes, but then Parliament in 1662 adopted the new prayer book, the 1662 prayer book, which is still to this day the official prayer book of the Church of England. Like I said, there weren't many changes. They modernized a little bit of archaic language. They included in the prayer book the readings in the lectionary. They, for the first time, put a Psalter, the book of Psalms, into the prayer book, but they didn't use the Psalter from the King James Version. They used the Psalter that Miles Coverdale had written in the Great Bible back in 1538. That's why if you ever go into our prayer book and look at our Psalms, they don't accord either with the King James Bible or with the Revised Standard Bible. They're an entirely different translation that dates all the way back to 1538 in the Miles Coverdale Bible. So this was the edition that was championed by Charles as he began to reestablish the church. This became the prayer book of the British Empire. This is the prayer book that was taken along as Britain expanded its empire around the world to Africa, to America, to India. And so that English prayer book of 1662 became a global liturgy. So it wasn't any radical change in the language of the prayer book in 1662 that made it so important. It was more its importance in reestablishing the Church of England as the established church for the entire kingdom. Because of this, and because so many places had been replaced with more Puritan-leaning ministers, 900 ministers of congregations would not go along with the new king and the new prayer book and vacated their churches. And so that meant that King Charles and his archbishop and his seminaries could put their people into nearly every single parish all across England. Well, Parliament didn't just approve a new prayer book. It approved a set of laws that would establish the Church of England as the only official religion for all of England. These were called the Clarendon Code, and they had 4 different acts that made these possible. First was the Corporation Act, that anyone who would serve as a municipal official had to ascribe as an Anglican. That was not rescinded until 1828. So you could not have served as the mayor of a town or a magistrate or a judge in England unless you were an Anglican until 1828. The Act of Uniformity made the Book of Common Prayer the only available prayer source in all of the churches. And again, in Scotland in particular, over 2,000 clergy backed down from that. They banned any religious gathering of more than 5 people unless it was an Anglican church gathering. And then really to add insult to injury, they passed something called the 5 Mile Act, that if you had been one of those non-conforming ministers and you had given up your church position, you weren't allowed within 5 miles of your old church, just to rub it in. And so this establishment of the church, of which the 1662 prayer book is the primary symbol, but these laws were also what made that possible, is what made the Church of England the established church for the British Empire. It went so far as to, you could not go to Cambridge or Harvard, or Cambridge or Oxford unless you were a professed Anglican. So no Catholics, no Presbyterians, no Baptists could attend those universities. So that's what we mean when we say the Church of England is the established church in the British Empire. Okay, so that's probably enough for today. And next week, we're going to start to look at what Anglicanism looks like outside of England. And so we'll look at what became the very first Book of Common Prayer to be adopted not on British soil, and that was our first American prayer book in 1789. So I think I'll leave it at there for today. And so if you want to refill your coffee cup or take a second, if you have, you can unmute yourselves now. And if people have questions or comments they'd like to offer, I'd be happy to respond, or we can have a little dialogue about it.
Great conversation.
Anybody have a question or any comments? Go ahead and unmute yourselves if you'd like to.
I was going to say there's a very interesting book that we read in our book club called The Club. And it's about Samuel Johnson and Boswell. And that is really going on, what they're talking about then is going on in the same period that you're talking about, in 1650 to 1700.
Right. Well, and that's a great book. I just loaded it on my Kindle, so I'm just getting started. It looks wonderful. I think that cafe society that those thinkers created became a response to established Anglicanism. That once the church was so well established in the 1700s, it became pretty boring. I mean, there was not a lot of great creativity and life in the church, but there was this explosion of enlightenment, philosophy, and dialogue. And Samuel Johnson, you know, his biography is really the best example of that. I can't wait to read that book, Jim. Sounds like a great one.
You'll find it very interesting, and the people who were discussing it, besides Johnson and Boswell, people like Burke and some other well-known individuals in that time, they had varying degrees of connections with the church.
Yeah.
Peter, how did Presbyterianism become so dominant in Scotland? If Charles reestablished the common church, well, yeah, I guess that's the simple question. How did Presbyterian become established up there? Well,
it began back at the beginning of the English Reformation, and John Knox was obviously a major part of that. And from the Scottish viewpoint, when they overthrew Mary, Queen of Scots, that gave them permission to create a new church, which they literally called the Kirk. And the polity of that church was Presbyterian polity. It was rested more with the ministers and the people than with bishops. And from there on, bishops became the symbol of English hegemony over Scotland. And so James handled it one way. His son Charles tried it a different way, and it led to an actual war. Well, the Scottish people felt they won that war. And so they won the battle for their style of church. King Charles allowed Presbyterianism to become the established church of Scotland. So the Presbyterians were connected to Parliament, owned all the church buildings, and in 1711, Parliament had to pass a law that allowed Anglican worship to be reestablished in Scotland. And that Scottish church, that Scottish Anglican church, which was not the official church at all, becomes a very important part of what we'll talk about next week, because it was really the Scottish Anglican church that sponsored the church in the United States of America, much more than the Church of England's sponsoring that church. And so simply by winning the war, and there were a group called the Covenanters, based on the covenant that they had written in 1560, that really rose up. And so from Scottish history, they feel like they fought a bloody war over this, and they won. And King Charles and the other kings after that weren't willing to try to reestablish Anglicanism. You have the same sort of history in Ireland, you know, the back and forth of trying to force Anglicanism onto what was, you know, in Scotland, it was a Puritan Presbyterian church. In Ireland, it was a Roman Catholic church, but the King of England was not very successful in either realm in trying to reestablish the Church of England as the state church.
Peter, one other question. Which of the various editions of the BCP was Thomas Cranmer so deeply involved in?
He wrote the 1549,
Okay.
which was the very first one. And then he wrote a very Protestant prayer book in 1552. But that was adopted only 6 months before Queen Mary, Bloody Mary, came to the throne. So it didn't get widely established. That's the prayer book that got rid of vestments, made the altar no longer a high altar against the east wall, but a table in the midst of the people. Really made a lot of radical changes. When Elizabeth did her prayer book in 1559, it looks very much like Cranmer's 1549 and 52 book, except she reverted to some of the practices that were more Anglo-Catholic. And when the book was approved by Parliament, it said, "And all sacramentary and liturgical life that was allowed in the second year of King Edward is still allowed today." Well, it was after the second year of King Edward that Cranmer had forced all these much more Protestant ways on the church. But he was the author, and because the language is so similar, you see his poetry and language in our prayer book today. Certainly in Rite 1, but even in Rite 2, the cadences and the prayers, many of them would go all the way back to Thomas Cranmer.
Here we go. I have a question, or just a bit to add there. Before I moved out here, my home parish back in Maryland was begun around 1650 with a group of, I think, loyalist refugees who came to the U.S. to save their heads, as it were, from the Roundheads.
Yes.
And although the first record we had of a baptism was 1669, it might be questionable if the 1662 prayer book had even made its way over to the colonies at that time.
Right.
But it was fascinating, being in a parish with that much history.
Right. And tied to the troubles of the English Civil War.
Yes, yes.
Well, anybody else have something?
It was interesting, that period then where they threw the prayer book out.
Yes.
Remind me how many years that was.
1649 till 1660.
Okay. Same time as then Michael's church.
Yes, right. That's why they had to escape to Maryland to get away from Cromwell.
Well, I'm looking forward to the continuation, Peter, next week. This has been very interesting. It's the first time we've signed in, and it's really a tickler, teaser. Forward to next week.
But I especially love seeing everybody's faces. And Elle and I fly back, God willing, and with lots of protective gear on June 18th. And so once we start to be able to do anything in person, I hope I get to see some of you in person. But in the meantime, we have 3 more weeks in this setting to continue this class.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Looking for
All right. Well, take care.